Queen Victoria gave Prince Albert a place at the center of her work, her home, and her sense of order. She gave him trust and daily closeness, building a partnership that reached deep into government and the image of the crown itself. They shared 9 children and a working life where she ruled and he advised. Then he died in 1861, and the woman at the center of the largest empire on earth did something the public never forgave quickly. The sanitized story says she was a grieving widow who wore black and mourned him for the rest of her days. That version is not false, but it leaves out the daily labor of what actually happened. The archives offer a much harsher reality. The palace did not simply become quiet. Victoria turned her loss into a routine so exact and stubborn that it still startles people now. She stopped one specific space entirely in time. She turned the Blue Room, where Albert died, into a memorial and kept it there for more than 40 years. In that frozen room, his clothes remained precisely where they were. His writing materials stayed on the desk. One particular object stood exactly where it was left, a medicine glass. A servant could lift it in seconds. A maid could wipe the table clean in a minute. A royal household, with its layers of polished control, could clear a room almost before the air had changed, yet the glass stayed. A medicine glass belongs to illness, care, worry, and the waiting hours of decline. In most homes, it would be washed or thrown away once death had passed. Victoria turned it into emotional evidence, a marker saying this was the hour and the place where loss entered. The object was left there because usefulness had ended and remembrance had taken over. Leaving that glass in place kept the final chapter open. A preserved death room is different from mourning clothes or public tribute. Mourning clothes travel with the body, and a statue stands at a distance. A room kept unchanged holds the final moment still, trapping the air of the last days and insisting that no ordinary life will sweep it away. The untouched medicine glass was a refusal to let the scene close. At first it seems tiny, but it becomes central because a medicine glass is tied to care. Someone fetched it, filled it, and set it down near a sick man. Then it stayed. General grief does not preserve furniture and bedside objects in place decade after decade. General grief does not leave illness tools exactly where they last stood. A directed memorial does that. A queen's command does that. The room held not just sorrow but status. Only power can stop time this way. Ordinary people lose the room as the bed is used again, and the final glass is washed or thrown away. Victoria had another option. She could make memory expensive. She could ask a household to maintain absence as if it were a living presence. The objects around him did part of that work. Clothes say body, writing tools say mind, and the medicine glass says final illness. Together, they create a complete scene that does not let him become abstract. She preserved stages of him, the man who dressed, the man who wrote, the man who took the medicine, and the man who occupied this room until the end. Accounts say the room was maintained exactly as it had been. The room was no longer treated as a living bedroom. It became a sealed statement inside the palace. Someone had to keep others out. Someone had to keep dust and ordinary change from taking over. Someone had to guard the room from normal life. For 4 decades, that labor served her choice. New servants came and went. Public events rose and faded. Politics shifted, and family life moved forward. Yet inside that room, the glass kept speaking the same sentence. He has just been here. The demands went far beyond the death room. The Royal Collection Trust states that Victoria ordered Albert's private rooms preserved exactly as he had left them. She turned his absence into a strict household duty, managing grief like an order from the throne. Servants were instructed to maintain a haunting daily sequence. They laid out his clothes, They placed clean towels in his dressing room every single day. Hot water was brought to his shaving stand every morning. The palace staff had to behave as if he were still part of daily life, acting out a morning routine for a man who would never arrive. The hot water detail is the sharpest part because it was tied to shaving, a routine so ordinary it belongs to life before ceremony. Continuing to bring it was a deliberate act of preservation. It crosses a line between memory and preservation. Mourning custom can explain black clothes and silent rooms, but hot water carried every morning to support a routine that could no longer happen shows something more exact. The entire household was ordered to carry her loss in their hands, practicing his return in miniature, one task at a time. The documents drag the story out of the soft fog and into a room with towels, hot water, and an empty shaving space. The Royal Collection Trust record frames the interiors as a living memorial. A living memorial is performance repeated on schedule. The palace became a place where grief had a timetable. Someone had to enter an empty room and act as if the next moment still belonged to Albert. Outside the palace walls, the public faced a different kind of boundary. Britannica describes her condition during this time not as a brief season of sadness, but as deep depression, long mourning, and years of partial retirement. She withdrew from the ceremonies people expected from a monarch. Historical accounts note she stayed away from much of London and rarely appeared in public, especially in the early years after 1861. She avoided the most visible setting where monarchy displayed itself to the nation. She stayed much of the time at Windsor. Victoria was not some minor royal fading into a private home. She was the monarch, and every missing appearance carried weight. Every empty ceremonial space became part of the story. The black clothing became a document in plain sight, and her absence became a public record. If Victoria had stopped all state business, the old account of a total collapse would be easier to keep. But the evidence points another way. It is the record of a woman choosing which parts of queenship she could still bear, and that choice carried a heavy cost. Public monarchy depends on being seen. The country did not only want government from her, it wanted spectacle, ritual, visibility, and reassurance. It wanted the queen herself, not just the machine of monarchy, still running behind doors. The nickname Widow of Windsor was the public's way of turning that choice into a verdict. The phrase says she is defined by grief, but also by where she shut herself away. It reduces a reigning queen to a mourning wife and a residence. That is not a neutral label. It is a public summary of impatience. She was no longer just Victoria, the sovereign in the popular mind. She became the widow at Windsor, the absent figure in black, the woman who would not come out and reassure the country that monarchy still had a human face. The label stuck because it was easy, and because it let people turn discomfort into a story they could repeat. She entered long-term mourning. The years after 1861 were marked by seclusion so visible that public feeling shifted around it. Her black clothes became one of the strongest visible records of that refusal. She wore mourning so steadily that the image hardened into identity. Black was no longer just what she put on, it became how people read her reign after Albert. The historical accounts also confirm she continued her official duties. She still worked, signed papers, and ruled behind closed doors. She kept the machinery of rule moving. What she withheld was the visible performance of queenship. Because she stopped showing her face to the nation, her popularity dropped. The system could tolerate sadness if it stayed decorative, but she centered her life around loss and kept the public outside it. By the 1870s, political reality closed in. Accounts say she was gradually persuaded to reappear more often. The word persuaded suggests pressure, influence, and repeated effort from a system that needed her visible again. When she did return to the public stage, she did not return to the bright colors of ordinary royal life. Victorian Britain had strict rules for mourning. There were established stages, specific fabrics, and social time limits. A widow might begin in full mourning, often in deep black, with dull fabric that did not shine. Then she would pass into half mourning, where softer colors could return. Society provided a schedule so people would not stay frozen forever. Victoria broke that custom in plain sight. She stayed in full widow's black for the rest of her life. A surviving mourning dress linked to her remains at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The fabric shows a look that was formal, controlled, and stripped of festive court display. Guides from the period laid out what widows should wear, and Lancaster history notes how mourning dress worked as social language. It told strangers what loss you carried and where you stood in the mourning process. Victoria knew those rules, which makes her refusal to move beyond black an intentional statement. Her black dresses said that loss still governed the room, and Albert still stood at the center. The dark wardrobe did political work. The black silk gave her moral seriousness and wrapped her in restraint. It told subjects that pleasure had ended and duty remained. It acted as a shield against anyone expecting her to step back into a new role or consider remarriage. Even a gradual shift into lighter colors would have signaled a new chapter. She shut that door herself. The clothes protected the throne with an image no one could challenge without seeming cold. Every appearance reminded the country that she was permanently claimed by the dead. A lifelong mourning wardrobe meant repeated acts of selection. Garments were made, worn, replaced, and chosen again. Each new dress repeated the same message that she was still in sorrow and would not step back into color. A single black dress could be impulse, but a lifetime of black dress is intention. Her personal wardrobe soon changed the emotional weather of an entire society. A paper cited through PubMed outlines how her choice helped shape mourning fashion far beyond the palace. Her long black wardrobe became part of what people now think of as Victorian. Royal habits set the tone for upper-class and middle-class behavior. The records state her long mourning. Preserved rooms, black dress, and constant memorializing helped normalize the idea that death should be carefully staged, emotionally displayed, and materially managed in Victorian society. The period developed an elaborate mourning etiquette and a massive mourning industry. The Queen's grief became a model many subjects tried to imitate. A booming mourning culture of black clothing, memorial jewelry, funeral etiquette, and household rules around death grew with approval from the top. Grief became an economic engine. There were things to buy, wear, keep, and display. The dead became part of household consumption. Victoria did not invent memorial jewelry or black clothing, but her long public ritual helped make those items feel necessary across the nation. Death was no longer just a loss to endure, it became a social condition to navigate. The public copied the scale, seriousness, and symbolism she provided. People bought the right clothing, kept the right objects, and followed the right etiquette to manage their homes around the dead. A temporary response would have remained personal, but a permanent one became public culture. It gave an intense kind of mourning a moral shine. When ordinary women wore black, it could mean sorrow. When Victoria wore black for the rest of her life, it meant status, duty, and example. The private choices of the sovereign legitimized the heaviness of the era. While the empire copied her black dresses, Victoria kept far closer items for herself. The records show she requested a plaster cast of Albert's hand after his death. A portrait can hang on a wall or flatter a subject for court effect. A hand is tied to touch, habit, and everyday closeness. A cast freezes that feeling into matter, proving the person was real and warm. Historians and royal records describe a broad habit of keeping him near through clothing, objects, and preserved spaces. The plaster cast fit exactly into that world of tactile memory. Rumors later claimed she slept with it beside her every night. That nightly bedside detail is less secure than other claims. But the verified facts carry enough weight without the legend. She possessed the cast, treasured it, and tied it to her own final arrangements. Decades passed between Albert's death and Victoria's own. Whole political eras shifted, governments changed, children grew old, and the empire moved through crisis and expansion. Yet a funeral account notes that a plaster cast of his hand was among the personal items placed with her when she died. The object remained attached to her memory until the very end, crossing the last threshold with her. It was part of the structure of her widowhood from his death to her own. Victoria kept mourning alive so long that whole generations grew up thinking grief was simply her natural state. The world watched the severe widow rule for decades. People expected her final moments to reflect the dark aesthetic she had forced onto a century. When Victoria was laid to rest, reports say she did not choose widow's black. She chose white. She asked for her wedding veil. She also had Albert's dressing gown placed beneath her body. That is a final statement. The woman the world had watched mourn for decades did not want death to look like separation. She arranged it to look like return. The burial details suggest Victoria did not want her last appearance to be ruled by the crown. She wanted it ruled by Albert. The white veil linked her death back to her marriage in 1840. Royal Central ties the veil directly to that meaning. The veil symbolized her marriage and a final return to being Albert's bride. The dressing gown made the gesture domestic and close. British heritage treats the gown as another sign that she wanted union after death, not monarchy, as the center of her identity. Not a crown, not an item of state, but a personal piece of domestic clothing that suggested mournings and ordinary companionship. These burial choices were not meant for crowds lining the streets. They were inside the coffin, hidden from view. They belonged to the last private space a ruler has. Reports about the white veil and Albert's dressing gown survive because household staff watched, attendants handled objects, and those who prepared the body noted what was there. The widow in black was not the final role she chose. The bride was. Black had dominated her life for so long. Black was the history books, and black was how her grief entered national memory. White interrupts the whole long black narrative. It tells you that the endless widowhood was not the final point. For the public, black had been the language of loss. For Victoria, white at burial seems to have become the language of return. Victoria gave Albert her youth, her marriage, her trust, and her family life. Then she spent decades driving the public theater of grief that followed his loss. The world kept the image of the widow in black. She seems to have kept something else for the end. In the coffin, away from the crowd, away from empire and away from the official picture, she set white against black and placed him close again. The state could bury a queen, but she arranged as far as she could to arrive as a bride.